The secret to good clickbait is to not lie about the contents of the video, but to say something that is true and actually does happen in the video. And you say it in the most exciting way you can, or in this case, worrying, because I reckon a lot of you are going, "Oh no, Burger!" Not to be parasocial or anything, but are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Thank you, person who is a complete stranger to me. I do actually genuinely appreciate your concern, even though I don't know who you are, but I'm not going insane. I hope. You know, obviously you can never know for sure. However, I am still giving up on my mental health, and I am doing it so I can really take care of my mental health in a way that works for me. For a long time now, probably always, there has been, something up with the thinking machine that I have up here, and it's simply different from what we might consider the norm. That's what's wrong with it. And it can make my life pretty difficult a lot of the time. On the other hand, the way my brain works and all the difficulties I have had to overcome as a consequence of stubbornly staying true to myself have brought me great fulfillment in life. But the simple truth of the matter is, I do not know what exactly it is that is wrong with me, or rather, I don't know the name of it. Its true name, that is. It's more like an ancient eldritch entity that goes by many monikers, but you can never know what it's really called because it defies human comprehension, apparently. I've spent years seeing various different psychologists trying to find an answer to that question, like what's it called, what I have, and I have yet to receive the same answer twice. I've been told I have schizophrenia because I always carry with me a sense of paranoia, like I'm being watched through magical means, and I can suffer from delusions when I'm under emotional duress, plus I also have some persistent delusions that I cannot help but believe even though I know they are untrue. And I sometimes have disjointed and disorganized thoughts and speech patterns where it feels like different parts of my brain are just disconnected from each other. I've been told I have chronic depression because I feel empty and sad for no good reason for extended periods of time and have severe lack of motivation and anhedonia, anhedonia is when you derive no enjoyment from activities that you usually enjoy doing. I've been told I have ADHD because I have trouble keeping my attention focused on things outside of when I am just hyperfixated on them for a few weeks. Performing very simple tasks and switching tasks especially is extremely tough for me because I receive no sense of accomplishment from getting things done unless they're like big monumental things. I've been told I have OCD because I have a lot of thought impulses that force me to do odd shit in order to alleviate mental distress. Like when I brush past the door handle, when I, with the back of my right hand, I need to go back and do it with the left one too, otherwise it won't be even and it'll stress me out until I do it. But then I do it, and it wasn't exactly the same way, and so I have to spend like a minute trying to find a way that feels exactly the same on both hands. I've been told I have Tourette syndrome because I have quite a few tics. Right now it's happening because I read the word Tourette syndrome. You may notice them sometimes when you watch my videos, and suppressing them causes me stress, and I get triggered when I see other people with Tourette's have their tics, and right now I have them in front of my mental eye, and that's my boyfriend has them also, so sometimes we're just on the couch spazzing out, as it were. The internet has been trying to diagnose me with autism so much that I always brought it up with psychologists, and the few that actually considered it and tested me were like, "Nah, dude, you don't have it." I've made a whole video about this. Though I did have one who really, really wanted to diagnose me with borderline personality disorder because it runs in the family for me, and who seemingly had a pretty hard time accepting that I don't have that. I don't think I had any of the core symptoms. All this wasn't a full list of the symptoms and diagnoses that I have and that were thrown at me. I have neither the time nor the inclination to go to the entirety of my mental health medical history, open though I try to be with it. But what I will tell you is that for none of these things did they give me a formal diagnosis. And here we actually do see a common thread. It all boiled down to some version of them saying, yes, you do indeed display enough symptoms to warrant a diagnosis, But as a person, you function, these days at least, to a degree that you're not impaired enough by the metrics of this particular condition for me to say that you are ill. And I don't have the time to take on new patients right now. Now, if we take the totality of my symptoms, because I have quite a lot of them, sure, and yes, I am impaired. Life is difficult for me quite often. But if we color within the lines of each category, no. And also, I should go see this and that specialist on this and that disorder. Fascinatingly, I never had all of the symptoms of any of the disorders that were suggested as diagnostic options, which is actually, that's very normal, by the way. It's very few people have all of the symptoms of the thing that they have and express them to the same extent. But when it comes to schizophrenia, yes, I have delusions, but I've never hallucinated anything. When it comes to ADHD, I have great difficulty tasking, but time blindness is entirely a non-issue for me. I am a clock-ass motherfucker. When it comes to OCD, I have no obsessive grooming habits. Like, yes, I like to be clean a bit more than the average person, but not excessively so. With Tourette's, I have no verbal tics, which actually are very rare even among Tourette havers. It's like 10% of them have coprolalia. And I have no particularly complex tics either. Depression fits very well, actually. But here's the funny thing about depression. Depression is comorbid with pretty much everything, because every kind of neurodivergent and disorderly thinking lends itself to feeling rejected and dejected by society, and, you know, like you're worthless. And the more I have gained a grip on the folds and fissures of my mind, the less frequently and less severely depressed I became. So I was like, what gives? What the fuck is going on? Do I just have the mild versions of all of those things? Do I have all of those things? That seems unlikely to the point of severe implausibility. And it was suggested to me, not by a psychologist, a clinical one I was seeing as a patient, but a friend of mine who happens to be a psychologist in his spare time, by which I mean professionally, just not of the clinical variety, that I might have something else entirely, because apparently it turns out all of those diagnoses are bullshit. They're not bullshit, just to make this clear. They're real things that a lot of people suffer terrible consequences from, often not even because the way their brain works is different, is inherently, like, bad, but because society is built in a way that it treats these people as worthless. So a lot of the symptoms of various diagnostically defined disorders are quite similar. It's just almost the same list, but the field of psychology has found good reasons to make them into distinct categories. And quite frankly, almost nobody always displays like a perfect 10-type score on the diagnosis. You usually just need to hit a certain threshold of symptoms and presentations of symptoms to qualify. And a lot of people apparently have symptoms from very different corners of the DSM, which is the manual that most psychologists around the world use to diagnose patients. It's really fucking ticky today because I'm thinking about it. Now again, this does not mean that the words in the DSM are bullshit. The reason they are in there is because statistically certain clusters of symptoms show up much more frequently than others, so it makes sense to group them as the same underlying condition. Or it seems like a particular mechanism has been identified as causing a certain cluster of symptoms to happen. That also, it would make sense to make them the same cluster. And by no means do I mean to say that psychologists and neurologists are fumbling around in the dark, which is not even a judgment I am qualified to make anyway, but they absolutely are fumbling around in the dark. And like, how wouldn't they be doing that? The human brain is the most complex thing in the known universe. This is not an exaggeration, by the way. It really is. And they are investigating emergent properties of this most complex thing in the universe, trying to help individuals with their own particular idiosyncrasies. These are incredibly intelligent, educated, and wise professionals, equipped with the powerful tools of modern scientific methodology. But they're exploring a cave that's like bigger than every other cave put together. If you have a question, they are the best people to ask. But you know, what the fuck do you expect? Miracle working? They don't do that. They do science. Because what they want to know is what's actually going on. And it's a very scary notion to think that psychologists don't just not know all the answers, but they don't have like most of the answers, and nobody else does either. In fact, the few answers that they do have, they're the best ones that you're gonna get anywhere. But because we all have a mind, or so I am told, we all feel qualified to have an opinion on this, when, again, we really shouldn't. Or should, really, because as much as we may only feel like we understand our mind, there is a point to that is a good one to be made, because we're the person that spends the most time in it. It is easy to miss all the forest for the trees, and that is what mental health care should be about. Because here's the thing, all of those diagnoses thrown at me didn't really help me in and of themselves. If anything, they made me more confused, and I am still confused. I was seeing all these psychologists, and none of them could really aid me in the pursuit of the oh-so-elusive goal of finding a way to exist as a functional and happy entity. They all just did a session or two, sometimes 3, you know, if they had a lot of time. They're way overloaded right now and have been for many years to come to, you know, like half a diagnosis, basically. A lot of them were like, look, if you had come like 5 years ago when you were really broken, we could have given you the diagnosis, but we can't anymore. And if the first of them hadn't told me to see a second one, I would never even have embarked on this journey of collecting diagnoses like baseball cards, like Magic the Gathering cards, like Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a lot of card collecting. Except, of course, the first one wasn't the first one. Because before this conga line of mental health professionals back in like 2017, when I was having a severe mental health crisis, I went to see a therapist for the first time as an adult. I had seen them as a child. And I saw him weekly for like 2 years. We talked about life, the past, the present, the future, my struggles, how I was trying to find my way in the world, and it helped. His outside perspective helped me understand myself so much better, to identify patterns within myself and seek out techniques to stop myself from spiraling into doom as I was regularly doing. He showed me ways in which I no longer had to be the victim of my own thoughts. But what he never did was diagnose me. Like, sure, when I outright asked him, like, what is going on, he was like, well, you're clearly very depressed. And one other time, he said that many of my problems are the result of unsatisfied primary narcissism, which I thought sounded terrible, but it's basically a fancy therapist way of saying your parents failed to care for you, which is not a diagnosis as such. But understanding this really helped me, because often when I was in emotional distress, because I felt like the people I was closest to didn't actually care about me, I was able to identify and label that thought as a pattern established during my childhood and adolescence, when the people who should have given me love instead didn't do that. And when I realized this, I started to go deeper into self-diagnosis, which is rightfully very controversial, and I do not think people should be going around diagnosing themselves just willy-nilly. At least get like half a diagnosis from a mental health professional you've seen 2 or 3 times. I went into communities of people with these diagnoses that were assigned to me, and they all had, you know, in many ways their experiences spoke to me, and in other ways, of course, they didn't. Just like the doctor ordered. But being in those spaces and finding the many resources that they offered was bountiful for me, because my work was rewarded with a wide array of insights and techniques that today help me manage the particular symptoms that I do have, and which do severely affect my life. I think self-diagnosis can be highly problematic if it is done just to seek a term to label yourself with, which you can, then use to beat other people over the head with, or to, not explicitly and not on purpose minimize the struggle of people whose symptoms are more severe than yours. The label isn't the thing that's gonna help you function or, be happy. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people do need the label in order to get the help that they need, especially if they require particular aid or medication to function in this capitalist world. Very often they could function perfectly fine in a different way, but unfortunately we do live in a society, and that society, though it's gotten better, still expects you to color within the lines. And while it's okay to have a headache every once in a while and take an aspirin without being diagnosed with some sort of complex headache-creating syndrome, The same is unfortunately not true if you run out of decision-making juice so quickly you can basically get through only half a day of work. All mental health is a spectrum. There is no clean break between any two distinct categories, and many of the symptoms that people with mental health issues struggle with are things that people who are much closer to the norm also struggle with sometimes. Just not as much and not as persistently. And you just cannot assign a score to it. Everyone is divergent from the norm in some ways, much like there is not an average person with 1.99 arms. The strategies that people with more severe symptoms often use to keep themselves from falling out the chariot can be immensely useful to many people who do not share that formal diagnosis, and also completely not the thing that another person with the same symptom and the same severity of it needs. It's a very personal journey. After my psychotherapy and now living in a world where I understand myself pretty well, I should say, I can manage the symptoms I do have, even not knowing what label best describes me. I couldn't function in the 9-to-5 regular society. If I had to ever do that, I probably would have to get some sort of diagnosis, but that isn't the reality of my life. I am lucky enough to have found a niche in society, though it's, often hard, where it's manageable for me to operate most of the time. Just this last October, I put on a whole ass convention for nerdy stuff. I was the primary organizer, the guy they elected to be put in charge of the thing. And though, of course, I relied on many people for this project, I did that and I loved it. That's also why I didn't put out a second video last month. I needed to recover from the Changeling one, and also I had a very busy schedule. I'm back in university too. Very part-time, of course. This is still my job. This is still what I do, but I am back to learning about stuff, and I love it. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for that one therapist who focused on counseling and good advice. And also because I am tremendously lucky with all this shit in general. Like, the process of getting that therapist, it was literally, he was the third therapist that I had called when I finally came to the decision to get therapy. And I was like, hello, yes, I need therapy. How many months do I need to spend on your waiting list like everybody else? And he said, how about you pop by Tuesday? I have never heard this from anyone. Everyone just has to wait months and sometimes years. To me, personally, this is evidence that we as a society have become a bit too obsessed with diagnoses when really we need to understand what a particular idiosyncratic problems are and how to manage those. Which, yes, sometimes is because people want to be special snowflakes, but also because mental health is still constantly underplayed as a factor that affects people's lives, tremendously so, and having this sort of scientific legitimacy to it is a very good way of making sure your struggles are taken seriously. Because they're very real. It's difficult to talk to people about this. I was reminded of pretty recently because on one hand I want to normalize the fact that ultimately most neurodivergent people are, pretty normal, while at the same time not taking the punch out of the ideas associated with my various quasi-diagnoses to the extent that they would downplay the very real issues that they cause in my life and other people's lives. Quite frankly, I really don't think that that's possible. You're always going to do it wrong until broader society has had some time to adjust to the notion that this thing in our heads that we all think we know is actually pretty fucking complicated, but also not an alien enigma. And I do not think that the medicalization of mental health, useful and important though it is, has really helped all that much with that. Because it really isn't feasible to make every conversation about our afflictions into a map as large as the area that it represents. Like, no matter the concepts you're trying to convey, people will misunderstand you and think that your troubles are easier or harder than you tried to explain they were. Neurodivergent people have existed for way longer than the diagnoses for their neurodivergences have existed. And those among them that could afford to do so figured shit out and just sort of lived an unorthodox lifestyle. You know how poor people are crazy but rich people are eccentric? that's neurodivergence throughout most of history. And I think that in a society which holistically has become more interested in improving everyone's material conditions and sort of helping the diversity of people that make up humanity thrive and find their own path to happiness, we will have to return to what we have lost, at least a little bit, not too much please, if we want to make our way out of the jungle. But ultimately, of course, this is just my experience. And I can hear some of you typing out some very strong opinions out there. So just thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, consider buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, I'm also still learning how to, like, function, you know, sometimes my needs change, because I change as a person, you're never really done growing. And like right now, for instance, I have a somewhat more rigid schedule than literally just one optional activity a week I attend for fun, and that burning me out is one of my main problems. So I'm trialing some other new techniques, and I'll see how it goes for me. It's unfortunate, but you'll have to experiment. Maybe they'll help me, maybe they won't. See you around, cunts.